Imagine the wealthiest families in America trying to recruit a decorated general to overthrow the President of the United States. Sounds like a great plot for a movie, and it was. A film called 7 Days in May. But here's the crazy part. This actually happened. Welcome to Real History with Teacher Eddie, the true stories behind the movies. In the summer of 1933, a retired Marine Corps general named Smedley Darlington Butler was approached with a proposal that quite literally could have changed the course of American history. Now, before we go any further, we need to talk about this man's name for just a moment. Just say it with me. General Smedley Darlington Butler. And if that isn't the most southern gentleman, mint julep drinking, porch sitting general name in American history, I honestly don't know what is. Which, by the way, sounds less like a military commander and more like a man who owns 3 plantations and a very judgmental horse. But behind the name was one of the most respected and decorated soldiers in American history. Smedley Butler was a Marine Corps legend. He earned 2 Medals of Honor, something almost no one else in American military history can claim. He served in conflicts across the globe and was widely admired by both the public and the rank-and-file soldiers who served under him. By the early 1930s, Butler had retired from active service, and unlike many of his contemporaries, he had begun speaking openly about something that made a lot of powerful people uncomfortable. He was critical of war profiteering, critical of corporate influence, and deeply committed to the idea that the military existed to defend the Constitution, not the interests of wealthy elites. And that's what makes what happened next so unsettling. America at the time was in crisis. The Great Depression had devastated the country. Banks had collapsed, millions were unemployed, bread lines stretched through the city streets, and public faith in institutions was hanging on by a thread. In 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office and immediately began reshaping the American government. The New Deal expanded the role of the federal government in ways the country had never seen before. Social Security, labor protection, banking regulations. For many Americans, these reforms represented hope. For others, especially some of the wealthiest and most powerful figures in the country, they represented something else entirely, a threat. To these elites, Roosevelt wasn't saving capitalism, he was undermining it. And in private conversations, some began to ask a dangerous question. What if Roosevelt had to go? This is where the story takes a turn that sounds like pure fiction. Smedley Butler began receiving visits from intermediaries, men with money, connections, and an unusual proposal. They wanted Butler to lead a movement of disgruntled veterans, a massive march on Washington, which would be backed by private funding. The plan, according to Butler, was to force Roosevelt into a ceremonial role and install a new position, a so-called Secretary of General Affairs, who would effectively run the government as a dictator. And Butler, with his popularity among veterans, would be the face of it. They wanted General Smedley Darlington Butler to be the dictator of the United States. It was a coup, carefully packaged to look patriotic. And this is the moment where history could have gone very, very differently. But Butler didn't immediately reject them. Instead, he listened. He asked questions, and he let them believe he was interested. All the while quietly preparing to expose the entire thing. And in 1934, he did just that. Smedley Butler testified before Congress. He laid out the plan in detail before the McCormick-Dickinstein Committee. According to Butler, wealthy industrial interests had attempted to recruit him to overthrow the elected government of the United States, including the president himself, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The committee investigated, and here's the part that makes historians uneasy. Much of Butler's testimony was actually corroborated. The committee concluded that the plot was real. They concluded discussions had taken place and that money had been offered. And yet, no one was prosecuted. None of the named so-called wealthy elite families, such as the DuPont family or even Prescott Bush, who was named, were ever prosecuted. The story barely registered in the national press, and within a short time, just faded into obscurity. In almost any other country, this would have been remembered as one of the greatest political scandals in history. But in America, it just quietly disappeared. Decades later, Hollywood would take this forgotten story and reshape it. In 1964, 7 Days in May hit the theaters. The movie tells the story of a military coup against a sitting president. But there's a crucial difference from the Smedley Butler story. In the movie, the threat comes from rogue generals, not wealthy businessmen. Because a military villain was safer, cleaner, less uncomfortable. Hollywood didn't invent the story, they just changed the parts that were hardest to face. And this is where the idea of print the legend comes in. There's a famous line from the old western, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. When the legend becomes a fact, print the legend. And 7 Days in May definitely printed the legend. But the real story, the one involving corporate power, political fear, and a retired general who refused to betray his country or the Constitution, is a far more interesting, unsettling, and true story than anything Hollywood ever put on screen. This was the real story behind the movie 7 Days in May. And in the next episode of Print the Legend, we'll look at another film where Hollywood softened the truth, because the truth was simply too uncomfortable to tell. I'm Teacher Eddie, and this has been Real History.